Well, Theresa May's had another setback. 3 MPs have quit her Conservative Party over her handling of Brexit. They're joining a new group set up by 7 politicians who left the opposition Labour Party earlier this week. This further undermines May's support in Parliament, where her Brexit deal was crushed last month. She's vowed to press on with attempts before Britain is due to leave the European Union on March the 29th. Today, she's in Brussels, hoping to convince the EU Commission President to reopen talks. Uganda's ruling party has endorsed President Yoweri Museveni as its candidate for the 2021 elections. It means the 74-year-old can now run for a 6th term. The move comes after law limiting the presidential age to 75 was changed. The 2017 ruling sparked widespread demonstrations, and a legal challenge to the decision is currently being heard by the Supreme Court. Museveni seized power in 1986 and once said leaders who overstayed their welcome were the root of Africa's problems. Protesters and sex abuse survivors are gathering in Rome ahead of a historic summit on how to deal with sex scandals that have rocked the Roman Catholic Church. Nearly 200 church leaders from around the world will attend the 4-day meeting at the Vatican. Stories of abuse have emerged from around the globe, and the Church has been accused of covering up crimes committed by priests. Protesters are angry with the Pope's slow response to the crisis. Back to the budget now, and a huge focus of today's speech are state-owned enterprises. Let's look at the profits and losses of the big ones from the 2017-2018 financial year. Eskom made a loss of 11.2 billion. Denel a 1.8 billion loss. Transnet made a profit of 4.9 billion. SAA a loss of 5.7 billion. And Telkom a big loss of 10.22 billion. Now, that huge drain on our economy was a starting point for Finance Minister Tito Mboweni this afternoon. In the past financial year, the state has had to increase guarantees for Eskom, Denel and SAA by 51.1 billion rand.
The SOEs pose very serious risks to the fiscal framework. Funding requests from SAA, SABC, Denel, Eskom, and other financially challenged state-owned enterprises have increased, with several requesting state support just to continue operating. Isn't it about time that the country asks itself the question, do we still need all these enterprises? If we do, can we manage them better? If we don't need them, what should we do?
And then there's Eskom. The Finance Minister has proposed 23 billion rand a year to support the power utility until its configuration is complete, but in its current state, it's still vulnerable to corruption, theft and fraud. Today, the Zondo Commission began its probe into Eskom. Here's the Commission's evidence leader, Advocate Vincent Maleka.
Eskom's annual revenues are close to triple of those of Transnet and 6 times those of SAA. The scale of its annual expenditure, with 55.8 billion on capital expenditure and 139.6 billion on operating expenses in 2016/2017 alone, appears to have made the utility particularly vulnerable to corrupt interests, with compounding the urgency of intervening to stop the alleged hemorrhaging of resources from this critical institution. So, Chair, you will see why it becomes important for this Commission to deal with questions of allegations of state capture relating to Eskom because of its centrality in the economy and also the sheer scale of its operational budget, capital expenditure, and also procurement activities. It is for that reason that we have decided to prioritize Eskom in the hope that what this committee would do in the course of its investigation will be able to help in the attempt to deal with those allegations and, to the extent necessary, make sure that they do not resurface again.
And then there are the unions protesting outside Parliament today. They're furious over the plan to split up Eskom into 3 arms and are completely unimpressed with the budget.
40% of women are unemployed, where 52% of the youth below the age of 24 are unemployed, where the African black majority have an unemployment rate of over 60%. This is the country of informal settlement. This is the country of the 4 matchbox houses. This is the country when it rains, there is no infrastructure to ensure that water is guided away from our kitchens and sitting rooms. This is the country of the gangsters. This is the country where 57 people are picked up in the streets dead every day. This is the country where the education system is dysfunctional, where the healthcare system is dysfunctional, where there are fewer police stations, where there is no resources of any kind.
I'm joined by Gabriel Crouse from the SA Institute of Race Relations and Sean Sweeney from the School of Labour and Urban Studies, City University of New York in our Cape Town studio. Welcome to both of you. Gabriel Crouse, 69 billion heading to Eskom for its debt, its reconstruction, restructuring. What does that mean? What can it actually do?
Well, it's important to note that it's not enough to cover just the debt servicing that Eskom has to pay every year, which is about 45 billion. It's also really worth noting that, as far as we can tell from the language of Mboweni's speech and the documents that have come around it, this is not a loan that the government is giving to Eskom. That's how bad Eskom is. To give it a loan seems incredible, it seems irrational, it makes you seem like a bad creditor. So this is a grant or some kind of gift in the hopes that Eskom will be able to use this as well as a few other strategies to get itself back on its feet, but it's not looking good.
Isn't it? I mean, it was described to me as basically putting a plaster on a flat wheel in a motor car. Yes.
I mean, I think the fundamental problem with Eskom is that it is not adding as much value as it is extracting from the economy. Jabu Mbuza, the chairman of the Eskom board, said that they're overstaffed by 33%. I think that's a conservative estimate. There's no ways that Eskom is going to maintain itself as a going concern without that problem being checked. There's going to be resistance to that, but it's important that Eskom adds more than it takes.
Sean Sweeney, what do you think the 69 billion buys here?
I'm not sure what it buys, to be honest. What I think we have is a narrative that's developing that is comparable to what Naomi Klein wrote many years ago, called the shock doctrine. There's a crisis, and this becomes an opportunity to sell off so-called state-owned enterprises. They used to be called public enterprises, or rather public services. And I think this is a regressive move. And as somebody who's lived in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom for many years, I can tell you that this kind of privatization will end in tears for South Africa and for the people of this country.
Do you think it's a form of privatization? They keep saying that it's got nothing to do with privatization, but is it the first step, and do you encourage it?
I really don't feel one way or another between privatization and keeping it public. I think the thing that matters most is that it as a business adds more value than it subtracts. And public companies can do that in parts of the world, and private companies certainly are strongly incentivized to do that. The question is the ruling party willing to take the sort of political knock or the political gain, as it may turn out to be, of deciding to let off workers? Its legacy shows that it's probably not going to be interested in doing that. So it might want some third party to intervene. Tito Mboweni mentioned the RGO, the reorganizing officer. That person might be seen as independent enough that if they say jobs have to be let go, that's not an ANC problem.
All right, a front man,
Yeah.
a woman.
Yeah.
Sean, what about the debt? I mean, would it be cheaper for Eskom to find money elsewhere, or is it cheaper for them to go to the government? And the government obviously will be impacted by this, and Moody's might look down on the government and rate us down again.
I'd rather not talk about the debt and how to pay it, except to say, where does the debt come from? The process of bringing in private players into the power sector in South Africa goes back over almost 20 years, if not longer. This corruption is a two-sided coin. It requires someone to be corrupted and someone to be the corrupter. And there's plenty of opportunities there to see where the debt is, in some ways, not the central question. The central question is, electricity provides, or should provide, a basic service for people and communities. And that service, yes, has to be paid for. But then the question comes, if it's basically becoming a commodity, which is traded for profit, which is what's been happening, then we've got a situation where the basic development model of healthy, publicly owned public services becomes basically distorted and perverted by that approach. That's what we're seeing globally, which is why many countries are reconsidering privatization. Many cities are taking back their power grids, and you see a process of deep questioning of whether privatization of the power markets, which introduces not just competition but risk, which is not what investors want to see, are capable of responding to major challenges such as investing in new infrastructure and climate protection technology. So I think this is very much a watershed moment for South Africa. But I would advise your viewers to look at what's happened in terms of privatization of public services all over the planet, and it's not a pretty picture.
What sort of business model should we be looking at here, do you think, Gabriel, and what best serves the public?
It's important to note that the public is served by an affordable and larger sort of platform of energy in this country. The Centre for Risk Analysis placed in around 2014 placed GDP growth ceiling at around 3% per annum based on what energy Eskom was really providing, and that estimate has come down to 2%. We can't really grow the economy more without growing the energy sector because it's upstream of everything else or of so much else. Manufacturing in this country has sort of halved in the last 2 decades by volume. It's flatlined for the last decade. That's jobs that are getting lost down the line because energy is not effective. For energy to be effective, it's got to be affordable, and it's got to be credible, and it's got to be reliable. You can't run a factory, and you can't really run a lot of services if you can't depend on the electricity switching on when you need it to switch on. So I think that kind of outcomes-based way of looking at things is important. We need energy that's reliable, and we need it to be cost-effective. How that gets done probably does involve introducing some competition. If the state has just proven itself to be challenged in dealing with this issue, if it came up with a plan that somehow explained how it is going to clean up its own act in a reliable and credible way, then I think that would be worth looking at. Short of that, and it would also entail the state taking ownership of the move of firing a lot of people. Short of that, the state needs to create frontmen, it needs to create third parties, it maybe needs to get international organizations involved, the IMF, for example, in order to sort of do the heavy lifting politically and to restructure Eskom in a, if not a more competitive way, a way that delivers the goods.
And Sean, I guess one of the problems, you've got this aging infrastructure, you've got the Madupe and the Kusile. How is that going to impact fixing Eskom and going forward?
I think all over the world there's a problem of where does new capacity come from, and there's a debate over the transition to renewable energy and how that can be brought to scale. In my view, and I think the historical record shows this, the best way of bringing it to scale is in the public sector. Let's look at the rural electrification programs around the world. If the logic of your other invited guests prevailed back in the 1950s and 60s, most of the world's global south would still be in the dark, because the idea of full cost recovery, of end users covering all the costs, that would have basically precluded them even being connected to the grid in the first place. There wouldn't have been a grid. So some things have to be kept public. Yes, Eskom and other public utilities and services should be fully transparent, fully democratized, with full input. But it cannot be allowed to be sold off to private companies whose only interest here is to make money, and that money will follow. The investment patterns will show, as it's been shown in health, education, and transport services around the world that have been privatized. That money will go towards those who can pay, those who are already rich, and those who can't pay will be left on the sidelines. Last point on this, the UN Rapporteur on Human Rights just did a study on the 30-year experience of privatization and concluded that there were human rights issues right at the center of this, of communities being excluded from basic services, health, energy, transportation, and so on. So I think we need to take a long, hard look at these past experiences before we jump into this privatization
okay, so a big
frenzy,
no to
which is what I see
privatization
unfolding
there.
right now.
I mean, what we heard from Tito Mboweni today and the attitude and the sort of way forward with Eskom, what does it mean for the other SOEs, which are also in trouble?
Yeah.
Do you see something similar?
I think they will. I think that what is extremely respectable in Tito Mboweni's position is that it's not ideological, that he's looking at the facts on the ground and he's saying that in order to solve a problem, you need to identify the problem. Now, that's an easy sort of platitude, but it's a really hard thing to identify the problem as being involved with oneself or one's party or one's administration. And I think he bravely admitted that part of what's happened there is government mismanagement, and the government needs to look at that if it wants to manage things better. I think that all SOEs are on strict warning. If you don't get your act together, if you don't pull up your socks post-haste, then you can expect to have your positions of power and your incumbents kind of entrenched sinecures to be ripped away from you and for someone else to be put in that position instead. It would be a great ideological cost for a party that has committed itself to sort of a big state, developmental state kind of solution to do that by privatization. It could also do that through international partnerships. It could do that in a variety, a sort of mixed bag kind of ways, but for the people who are in charge at the moment, it'll mean you're not in charge anymore. So I think that warning is important. I hope it's a serious warning, and I hope that if people don't heed it, they are taken to task for putting themselves before this country. It's a reasonable thing to do, but it's not something that anyone should get away with doing.
It's time, isn't it? Gabriel
Yes.
Crouse, Sean Sweeney, thank you very much. Fully subsidised education, that's Mboweni's intervention in the education crisis, over 111 billion rand to educate 2.8 million poor students. How does that work on the ground? That's up next.